I'm going to try out a strange subject to talk about. The subject of breaking up fights that we see in public. We read a lot in the news of Good Samaritans stepping in and trying to break up a fight and something horrible happening. Perhaps the Good Samaritan getting beat up or killed, or the police intervening and actually hurting or killing the Good Samaritan. I just read about one of those in the news today, which in part inspired me to make this video. Now, a lot of the comments that I read when I hear about those things in the news is, don't get involved with the fights, don't get in the middle of it, just stay out of it. If people are fighting, just let them do their thing, call the police. But what I've found for me, especially in the last few years, is I just get involved. It's like I don't think about it. It's like, or if I do think about it, it's like a split second where I'm like, wait, and then I just go for it and try to stop the fight. Now, I actually have never been hurt trying to stop a fight or actually stopping a fight. And I don't know, maybe I've stopped 4 or 5 in the last 3-4 years. And most of them have been in New York City. I was in China actually recently, and I broke up a fight in a city in China. So I wanted to talk about this. I was also talking about this subject with a friend of mine yesterday, a woman. And interestingly, a lot of the people who I've talked to who have broken up fights are women. And it's quite an interesting thing to think, why do some people get involved and stop a fight, and why do many people, if not most people, do nothing? Now, I'm going to talk about some of my ideas about it. The other thing is, do I stop every incident of violence that I see out in public on the street? And the thing is, I don't. So I want to talk about when I do get involved and when I don't get involved. Well, one thing is, when I do get involved, I mostly use my voice. I very rarely touch any of the participants who are fighting. And I think a part of it is that I just don't want to get hurt. I don't want to get physically attacked. I don't want to get killed. And I do recognize that it is a possibility. As soon as you step out of the crowd and get involved, you are actually putting yourself at risk, and you really can get hurt. Now, I think that can be a big reason why a lot of people don't get involved in fights. They don't want to get hurt. They're afraid of getting hurt, and I think it's a realistic fear. It's not a paranoia. It's not necessarily even a cowardice. It's just a terror. Oh my God, here are people who are doing this crazy thing on the street, and real damage can be happening or is happening, and people don't want that damage to get put on them. On the other hand, when I was talking with my friend yesterday, she said, yeah, I think that's part of it, but I think what can also happen is that some people like to watch a fight and they don't want to break it up. They like watching it go on and on and on. And I've seen that also. I think it can be true. But why do I want to break up a fight? Why do I want to stop it? I think one thing is just watching people be violent toward each other disgusts me. It just disgusts me. It makes me feel horrible. I'm also someone who in my childhood was a victim of violence multiple times by kids I knew in my neighborhood, by strangers, other kids, by one time by a friend of my parents, a guy, and by my dad. And in none of those situations did anyone intervene. Did anyone say, no, this is not okay, stop that? When my dad would go off on me and rage at me and scream at me, and sometimes it would extend into violence by hitting me, my mom never said anything. She never stopped him, not once. When I got attacked in school one time by a girl, older than me, much bigger than me, no one said a thing, nobody stopped her. When I got bullied and even beat up in my neighborhood as a kid, nobody stuck up for me. Now, I learned preventative techniques. I learned to have friends who were bigger and stronger and tougher who hung out with me, and that stopped people from attacking me. But in the moment of violence, especially if I didn't have friends around, nobody stepped up. Nobody did anything to stop it. And when this friend of my parents, this guy, was violent with me once, and I went and told my parents, they didn't do anything about it. They didn't stop him. And all these things, I felt betrayed. I felt abandoned. I felt so isolated and alone in my life. I had this horrible feeling that I didn't count. And I think by healing that, by going through and reclaiming my relationship with myself, by saying, I love you, Daniel, by really feeling that love for myself, by grieving the horror of having been betrayed, but of having nobody stuck up for me, nobody really cared about me enough to stop what was going on. By giving that to myself, I think I just naturally, spontaneous want to extend it to other people. Now, another thing is when I've seen fights on the street, and this is pretty much without exclusion, the people who are engaged in this, especially the people who are doing the more aggressive stuff, because a lot of times one of the people in the fights doesn't really want this fight to happen and is just trying to avoid it, and the other person is beating them up. Well, what I've seen is when these fights are going on, it's people acting out their childhood rage. Their rage from when they were kids, when they were abused, probably by their parents, because that's another thing. I do see a lot of parents abusing their children in all sorts of different ways, and I see it on the street, I've seen it from my window, I've seen it all around the world when I travel, and it's not just from dads, a lot of times it's from moms, and actually moms and nannies and women really abusing little kids. And I've seen them abuse boys a lot. Well, when these boys grow up, they're full of rage. They're full of that sense of horrible injustice about being mistreated. And a lot of times, if they don't process it, if they don't work through it, if they don't grieve it, they're walking around with that rage looking for someone to put it out on. And if they have kids, they probably will act it out on their kids. And if they don't have kids, well, they're still looking for enemies. And a lot of times they'll find someone out on the street, someone often weaker than them, who they can bully and beat up. And so when I've seen people in these fights, they have returned to that childlike place, that place of their child that's full of rage, and they literally are in an altered state where they're no longer an adult, they're no longer a mature, rational adult in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever, how old they are. They're suddenly 3, 4 years old, and they're just going at it, and with the body of an adult. Now, something interesting that happened to me in my professional work as an adult is I had a while where I worked with little kids. I worked with 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. I worked as a musician in an after-school pre-K program. I was an after-school pre-kindergarten teacher in the New York City public school system, actually in my neighborhood in Manhattan. And there were a lot of rough kids in my class, and there was actually a lot of physical confrontation between the kids. A lot of the kids came from tough families, came from violent families, came from tough neighborhoods, and experienced a lot of violence in their life, experienced a lot of physical violation, a lot of mistreatment, and so they acted it out with each other without even thinking about it. They were just little kids, just basically just above babies, just above toddlers. And so I broke up a lot of physical altercations. I don't know if I would exactly call it fights between 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, or 5-year-olds, but sometimes it was fights. Sometimes the kids were really going at each other. But I broke up a lot of fights. And what happened to me by doing that is I got a lot of experience of intervening in problems between kids that were 3, 4, and 5 years old. Now, interestingly, when I see these fights on the street, the people who are fighting, even though they're actually physically adults, are in that place of 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. So that skill set that I learned as an after-school pre-kindergarten teacher in breaking up fights, I have found is very, very useful. And so it's a big part of my technique, if you could call it that, for breaking up fights. One of the main things I do when I see a fight on the street, slap my hands together really, really loud and say, enough, or this fight is over, or stop it. When I broke up this fight in China just a few months ago, it was a horrible fight. There was a man soccer kicking another man in the face. Now, the man who was getting kicked in the face, the man who was on the ground, had punched a woman in the face and tried to take her mobile phone. I didn't know any of this until afterward, but what happened is the woman who had been punched in the face, she had a bleeding mouth, her husband intervened and started beating up the guy and kicking him in the face, got him on the ground, was just kicking him, and I think he would have killed him. The guy already had a concussion. All I know is I came along and saw this man soccer kicking a guy in the face repeatedly, and there was this whole crowd gathered around it, everyone standing around just watching. Just like in New York City when I've seen fights, everyone just stands back and just watches, what's going to happen next? Maybe they have some desire to stop it, maybe they wish it would stop, or maybe at the same time they're curious, liking to watch a fight. And also I've seen this. The crowds sometimes can go into that childlike place, and often when little kids get into really bad confrontations, the other kids don't intervene. They just kind of stand back and watch, what's going to happen? It's like they're not necessarily in the most empathic place. They're just observing, curious. So when I broke up this fight in China, I just, like when the guy took a step back, I kind of got in front of him a little bit, not so that he would kick me, but enough so that it was going to make it a little bit difficult for him to kick this guy. I never touched him. And then I said, 不可以,不可以,为什么?你做什么? So I spoke a little bit of Mandarin, and he stopped, and he had this altered look in his eyes, and then he looked at me just shocked. He was full of rage, but it was like he gave me this look like a child, and he was probably 50 years old, wearing businessman clothes and big businessman shoes, and he just started going off on me in Chinese. And then the woman came and she had blood in her mouth, and she started going off on me and showing me her phone, and suddenly I put together what had happened. I said, sorry, Dwebuchi. I said, I'm sorry, and then I backed off. But the thing is, it snapped the guy out of it. The guy just went from being 3 or 4 years old in that rage to being like a man who was an adult. And I have seen the same thing on the streets in New York, a very similar dynamic where when I've broken up a fight, I think one of the last ones I broke up was 2 homeless guys. I saw this homeless guy wailing on another homeless guy and punching him in the face. And I just went right up behind him, but I was still probably about 5 feet back, and I slapped my hands together really loud and I said, "Stop it! Stop it! Fight's over!" Just like that. And the guy immediately stopped, and then he turned around to me and goes, "But he stole $1 from me." I was like, okay, but you can't hit him anymore. And the guy who was hit kind of got dazed, and he took a step back. And then the guy who was doing the punching, he just came out of his altered state, and he kept talking to me. He wanted me to affirm him. And I'm like, all good and well, but you can't hit him anymore. It's over. And then I told the other guy, okay, you're done, go away. And then the guy turned around and he screamed, the guy who was doing the punching screamed at him a little more, "You can never come back here." And then he turned to me, he kept wanting to explain why he was doing it. I was like, oh my God, I truly am talking to an angry 4-year-old who's trying to describe to me why he did it. And I became like a parent figure or a teacher, and I totally saw that. When I would break up the fights between the little kids when I was a teacher in school, they would always try to explain to me why their side was right or wrong, and why the other one was wrong, and why they were right. Now, another side for me in breaking up fights is all my years of being a therapist. And I was a couples therapist also, and I did a lot of family therapy as well. And with couples therapy, and certainly with family therapy, there are conflicts. Now, I never had a therapist, well, actually, that's not true. One time I did see someone grab someone else's arm in a family session. One person grabbed his father's arm, and I did stop that in a very similar way to the pre-K thing. Stop it, enough, can't do that, no more, that's not acceptable. But that was the only time in all the sessions I did that I ever saw that kind of violence break out. But a lot of screaming matches, and a lot of times what I always did actually, was be a referee. And the main thing I did as a referee was de-escalate. Always be respectful to the people, not curse, not grab them, not touch them, but make it very clear that the fight was over, that that screaming and yelling and cursing at each other, not acceptable, and that bringing it further and further up to the point where it even could escalate into violence was not acceptable. And instead, let's be adults, let's be rational, and let's talk about what's going on. Let's talk about our feelings. And what I found is all of that time intervening, tons and tons and tons of intervening in very intense and very personal conflict, really did make me feel more comfortable at getting involved in other people's lives when they were having horrible conflicts. But sometimes I don't get involved in fights. So I think of some of the times when I don't get involved. Well, one is I've seen some fights where there's groups of people. When groups of people are fighting, I tend to stay out of it more. Tend to call the police immediately, but groups of people are scarier, because then it's like I can get sucked in, or if I do say something, I'll say something from quite a distance. Just yell out, "Stop it! No more!" And a lot of times that can help. Just by verbally saying something, it introduces a new person, a new personality into this mix, and a more reasonable, rational personality. And I think it can help to break up a fight, because I have broken up a few fights with adults, but it's like, but yelling from a distance, but sometimes not. The other thing is with groups, or even individuals, when people have been drinking alcohol, when they're drunk, I'm much more hesitant to get involved. And I think it's just a question of personal risk, because I think drunk people are so much less reasonable. They're much less likely to snap out of that altered place. They're in a fuzzy place already where they may not be able to discern that I'm actually someone who's trying to help, that I'm a good person. They may actually start attacking me. And so that's another. The other thing is, generally I'm not out too late at night. So nowadays, when I was younger, I was out more at night, and I saw drunk people fighting, and it was just like, I am not getting involved in this. It was too crazy. But now I tend not to see that, because I go to bed early. I like that idea. Nothing really good happens after midnight. Pretty much true. It's like, so most of the fights that I've seen, actually almost all of them lately, have happened during the day. Though the one in China happened probably around 10 o'clock at night. But another thing is, I am very hesitant to get involved in domestic squabbles on the street, and I see them sometimes. When I see a guy and a girl screaming at each other. Now, I've seen a few fights lately where I see a girl trying to hit the guy. I saw that in China a few times. The girl's trying to hit the guy, and it's like, you know, sometimes the guy's not leaving. He may be sort of blocking the punches, but I'm like, I'm staying out of this one. This is their own personal thing. Also, seeing couples screaming at each other on the street, the guy screaming at the woman, it's like, I feel kind of bad that I don't get involved, because sometimes I really have the urge to, but it happened to me once, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, where I saw a guy pushing his girlfriend on the street, and I said, "You leave her alone, stop that." Well, guess what happened? The first thing is, he turned to me, he's like, starts cursing at me, and then guess what? She turns to me, and she starts, "Yo, stop," and she starts cursing at me, and I thought she was gonna attack me. And then I'm like, okay, I'm way in over my head. I'm getting involved in something that's not just two strangers having a 2-year-old conflict, you know, like little 2-year-olds fighting on the street. It's like, yeah, these people can be very immature in their fight, but this is like an ongoing kind of thing, and they're both involved in this dynamic. And I'm actually really scared, because I really don't want to get beat up. Now, would I get involved in some cases of a domestic fight in the street? Yes, I would, I think, but also I'm just scared of it. I'm very scared. Another thing, and this is a terrible one for me, I really feel very ambivalent, feel very mixed talking about it, is when I see people abusing kids on the street, when I see their parents abusing them. I've intervened several times. I've stopped parents from hurting their kids, but it's not like stopping strangers fighting on the street. I remember this one time, I was with a friend in the subway. I was way out in Brooklyn, and this woman got on and she started shaking her little boy, this 3-year-old, just shaking him so hard, and nobody said anything, and I just lost it. And I said, "Stop abusing that child, stop it right now." Well, what happened? She did stop shaking that kid, but several people, and it was women on the subway started yelling, "You mind your own business," and they're going off on me. And one of them said, "What, do you have kids? What do you know about raising kids? Do you have kids?" And then there was a few guys who just started looking at me, and I was like, oh God. I could see they wanted to just stand up and beat me up. And it's like, I think a big part of it is, in conflicts between children and their parents, the world generally sides with the parents. I think the basic attitude of our world is, the basic concept of society is that parents own their children. They can do whatever they want. And then there's the other thing, that if I intervene in a conflict between a parent and a child, it's like, well, maybe I can stop it in the moment, but when that parent goes home, they have complete liberty to do whatever they want to the kid, and they can act out their abuse even more on the child. Now, I have heard people talk about different ways of intervening and saying kind things to the parent, like, "Oh, it must be a hard day you're having," while they're in the middle of like attacking their child, and things like that can de-escalate the situation. And I really respect the people who can do that, who can keep a level head and talk in a reasonable way to the parent. Oh, hey, how's it going? Maybe I can share some food with you. Or, hey, you want to talk about that instead? And talk in a gentle voice to the parent. And that really can work in stopping a parent from abusing the child, and maybe just snap the parent out of whatever they were doing. The problem is, when I see parents abusing children, I am not that good at being rational. I'm not that good at being calm and saying interesting things and changing the subject. It's like I just say what I'm thinking, which is stop abusing that kid. And I kind of lose it myself. I think I'm too triggered by that because of my own history or too much empathy with the child. So maybe I'm not the best one to stop it. And I have been around people who have stopped parents from hitting their kids, and sometimes they just say, stop it, don't hit that kid. Now, another thing, and it's worked, sometimes I just get so terrified that I'm going to get attacked and beaten up. I think because so many times me going back to talk with my parents about how they abused me physically, emotionally, etc., just turned into me getting abused more by them attacking me and blaming me more. So I think maybe I still have unresolved trauma around defending myself from having been previously abused, and I think maybe I can get like too triggered in my mind when I watch this kind of abuse happening on the street. But it is interesting that in these situations with adults, it's like somehow spontaneously, intuitively, I know what to do. I know what to say in so many of the cases to stop the fight, to immediately make it end without me getting hurt. So anyway, I hope this is food for thought.